We don't have a whole lot of time for this Q&A, so I'm going to sort of open it to the audience. I have things that we'll be talking about in the next session at 4 o'clock, and I could certainly chime in. But just to start with, I can't think of a more heinous criminal depicted in the history of film than this guy.
Yeah, and he's pretty much the real thing. I mean,
And it's the real thing, and that's part of what makes it so powerful.
Yeah.
Unsettling, really. I mean, the violence takes on a different impact than in a picture like Goodfellas, to me.
right.
Because there's still some mythologizing in all of that.
Yeah.
And the realism, the stark, brutal realism is just...
After his, after Whitey's capture, I teamed up with my co-author again to write a biography of Whitey Bulger, and the subtitle is America's Most Notorious Crime Boss. And one of the things that I sort of came into focus after his capture, which is his place in history, so to speak. Because what we realized in writing his biography and putting his what we call his black mass years, the 15 or so years in which he had this corrupt relationship with the FBI, putting that in the context of an entire life, one of the things that came into focus for us was that, you know, you think of any of the gangsters in American history that have, marquee name recognition, Gotti or Capone and whatnot. Whitey Bulger can sort of match body counts with those guys and probably count money with them and stuff. But the thing that put Whitey Bulger to the front of the line, and why we call him the most notorious, is that he accomplished something that none of these other historic criminals ever accomplished. And that was to bring the FBI to its knees, where he had the FBI, or a band of corrupt agents, serving as his bodyguards in effect. And no other, I think, criminal in American criminal history can lay claim to that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And I want to just, underscore the courage of Dick Lehr and Gerard O'Neill in breaking the story. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. All throughout the picture, we see how if anyone crossed him in any way, they dealt with it, and I wonder how much fear you had in your body, in your heart, as you were dealing with this story.
Yeah.
Repeat the question. What was
The question was.
Get a little closer. I don't know why, but yeah.
The question was that Whitey didn't hesitate to kill anybody or who he thought might pose a risk to him or had crossed him. And the question was whether we as journalists had any real fear for our lives when we went down this alley. Well, back in the original Spotlight stories about Whitey and the FBI were published in 1988, and at the time we were really trying to. It's so fascinating how you go where the story goes, and what we originally set out to do was write a narrative, a deeply reported and in that sense investigative narrative that had never been done, the tale of two brothers. Because in the late 1980s, both Billy and Whitey were at the top of their respective gangs. All right? Sure, and Whitey, again, this is deep into the mythology of Whitey Bulger. He was seen as a Robin Hood of South Boston, a protector, kept drugs from Southie, all of which were later exposed to be lies. But he had this mythology. He was the crime boss who had the skill of a Houdini to elude any investigator who tried to track him down. So and then Bill had his own story because he had risen from the projects of South Boston to become Massachusetts' most powerful politician. We set out to just help put that story together. It hadn't been done, remarkably. And I worked on the Whitey side with another reporter by the name of Kevin Cullen, who is still a columnist at the Boston Globe. And sure, we picked up rumors, and a lot of it was rumors and suspicions from other police agencies like state police, the DEA, that something's going on with Whitey and the FBI. And we took it to be sour grapes because they couldn't catch him. But that's sort of part of the story. It's part of the atmospherics of law enforcement in Boston. Is this sort of divided, this division over Whitey, and Whitey's still out there. And then in the course of the reporting, to compress the story, we ended up, we kept hearing those rumors and we dismissed them in some way, but you still don't let go of it. And you're always testing it. And finally, it was near in the summer of 1988, I'll never forget it, and we write about it. There's a chapter in Black Mass which goes into the story behind the Spotlight series. We confirmed with two sources inside the FBI. They were confidential sources at the time, and one of them turned out to be, one of them was John Morris. It didn't happen the way it happens very quickly in the movie. And the other was a retired supervisor in the FBI who had been a deputy assistant special agent in charge of Boston overseeing the organized crime squad, and he was retired. And he was living in Rhode Island, and I went down to see him. And so you hear the echo of some of the dialogue, because when I met him, he agreed to meet me. We went for a walk. He didn't want to talk in his house. His first question to me was, "What do you know?" And I said, "We know. We'd heard it from Morris, but we needed to confirm it." And I had a tape recorder with me, and we sat down on the beach. And for the next hour and a half, he gave me a tutorial, basically, in what can go wrong when an informant gains the upper hand. And it was the history of Whitey Bulger and the Boston FBI. And it's a good thing I had the tape recorder going, because I would have dropped my pencil and my jaw would have just dropped open, with what I was hearing. It was just so unbelievable at the time. So that's when the project took a real turn to something that was revelatory and exposed. It was the tip of an iceberg. We didn't know about the murders and the cover-ups. That took years to come out. But we had cliche tip of the iceberg of what emerged as the biggest informant scandal in the history of the FBI. So that goes back. And now the question was, were we in fear for our lives? Well, a week or so before publication, Kevin, the reporter I mentioned, we're all sitting in the Spotlight team offices, and maybe you've seen some of those offices if you've seen the movie Spotlight. Very much the same offices on the mezzanine of the old Boston Globe. And Kevin took a call from an agent who I actually answered the phone. It was an agent by the name of Tom Daly who worked with John Connolly. He asked for Kevin. I gave it to Kevin, and Kevin started talking to this FBI agent, Tom Daly, who said he was calling as a friend, and that's always a signal that, uh-oh, something's up. And he also, the next thing Tom Daly said to Kevin was that if anyone ever asked, if I ever asked about this conversation, it never happened. And Kevin's not, he's just like, okay, what do you got? What do you got? And Tom Daly said, we know what you are up to there at the Globe about Whitey, and you guys couldn't be more wrong about this. And then came the kicker was, and you're writing about Whitey Bulger. And Kevin goes, yeah, I know. And he goes, Whitey Bulger, I'm paraphrasing, if he doesn't like what he reads in your newspaper, he wouldn't think twice about blowing your brains out. That gave us pause. We went ahead with the publications. Kevin and his wife happened to live in Southie at the time, so as a precaution, the Globe put him up in a hotel in downtown Boston. He probably should have moved to the West Coast in some ways. But no, nothing came of it. He had bigger worries, and after publication, to worry about Boston Globe reporters. But yeah, so there was a period there where it was a little nervy. Post-publication, once it's out there, it's less so. Once it's in public, and over time, and again, it took through the 90s as the truth began to tumble out and accumulate. Then it's then it's good. It's getting out there, in terms of the truth.
So to follow up on that, then, was
Sure.
there a subsequent publication or set of publications that culminated in the one that sent Whitey Bulger running?
Well, that's the funny thing. Again, this is that's what movies are adapted. There's so much time. There's so much history here to make a 2-hour movie out of 20 years.
Yeah.
It gets compressed and rearranged. That's why it's an adaptation. So, and that's the Wyshak character is key. He came to Boston. The stories came out in '88. They were discounted at the time, the FBI was still corrupted. Conley was still in power, and Morris and stuff like that. So it just sat there. In the early '90s, Weishak came and he teamed up with another prosecutor. His name is Brian Kelly. And they began to build a racketeering case against Whitey that resulted in his indictment in '95, and that's when he fled. Flemmi was captured, as you saw. During his pre-trial hearings, he launched what he called his informant in defense. It was a Hail Mary. I mean, this is all fascinating legal history. But he argued with his lawyers, you have to drop these charges. I was an informant for the FBI, as was Whitey. Any crimes we committed on FBI time. You can't go back on that. It was crazy. It's crazy logic, but it led to court hearings in 1998 for 10 months in Boston, federal court hearings, evidentiary hearings, exploring the relationship and the corruption. And it was the first time the government, the judge ordered the FBI into court, and the first time they officially acknowledged, obviously they lied to the globe, that Whitey Bulger and Flemmi had been informants for years. That was the critical mass for us to be able to write the book Black Mass. We had written episodically, we were just chipping away at it after that first big story in '88. But then finally by the late '90s, a decade later, we were able to put it together in another series in the Globe, and then the book Black Mass. And then the cases kept going. They arrested Conley, Morris cut his deal. That plays out all into the 21st century until finally Whitey's captured and he's put on trial in 2013. It's history, it's crazy.
Did any of the FBI people go to jail, or were they dismissed? What happened to that?
The one, Morris did not go to jail. Conley is still in jail. There should be others in jail, frankly. The one thing about, again, an adaptation and a compression in something like this a little bit plays into the FBI narrative that Conley and Morris were two bad apples, okay? You can't broad brush, but the record shows, the documents that, it's in the books, it's our book and other books. The hearings certainly demonstrated. There was deeply embedded corruption in the FBI prior to Conley and Morris. It went past those two agents, involved most of the agents on the organized crime squad. They all got away with it, ultimately. We've never had a full vetting and a full understanding of the scope of the corruption and how far, or if it did, it went into Washington. And again, so that's a little quibble I have.
Where's Billy now?
In South Boston, retired. Yeah.
Why did it take so long to catch Whitey?
Good question. Again, we kind of in the biography, the sequel to Black Mass, Whitey, we go into that in terms of one of the biggest problems is that in the first 18 months when he fled, that's when someone's most vulnerable, and he was on the road making mistakes, staying in touch with South Boston, namely Kevin Weeks, because he hadn't rolled yet and become a government witness. That's when he should have been caught and could have been caught. The problem was John Conley was still in business, and the FBI was still compromised, so it was hardly a united front in pursuing him. And then after he fled in January '95, by the end of '96 is when he settled in with his girlfriend in Santa Monica, quote unquote retirement. And then he he cut all ties. The first thing you do if you're on the run is to cut ties. And he hadn't done that for 18 months. But once he hit Santa Monica, Kevin Weeks never spoke to him again. So even though Kevin became a government witness and could tell him about the history and where the bodies were buried, he couldn't tell him where Whitey was anymore. Whereas in that first year and a half, he could have.
How do you feel about the credibility of the FBI today?
It's tough. It's tough to not, I'm trained to be skeptical about most things. That's a journalist training. The dial is turned up, way up when it comes to the FBI because of the scope of the corruption here, but then the scope of the lies and the effort to cover it up. And then just, it's an agency they've done an enormous amount of good stuff. Believe me, I don't want to but they are so PR conscious, and even after his capture, and even after in 2011, to be on some of the cable news shows, commenting on his arrest, along with some FBI officials, who, after all that's come out about the scope of the corruption and stuff, talked about John Connolly and John Moore as the two bad apples, the rogue agents, as if it was a very narrow, limited problem that had caused a lot of harm, but it was it was restricted to two agents. You can't do that when the record and the history shows otherwise, and yet they'll stick to that PR thing, in claiming for the greater good of the Bureau, but it just makes you keep alive your skepticism about their credibility. Yes?
That's what was so brilliant about the scene of the cop and the coming over to the car, and they start, talking to each other totally, and you get to realize suddenly that there's a very fine line between the cops and the criminals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
Very little psychological about the film. Why Whitey is the way he is, and why Billy apparently is not the way he is. Whitey comes across as pure evil. What is there, perhaps it's in the book, what is there about his background, his nature, his experience that produced this monster, in contrast to his brother, who is not a monster?
Well, his brother hasn't killed people. He's crushed people in his own way.
I read the Globe every day still, so
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. Well, I'd actually, we address that a lot in the biography. It's almost like I try to sell you a copy of my biography, Whitey, because we actually, it goes into his relationship with his father, it goes into the fact that he's a psychopath, and we don't know what creates or makes a psychopath, but that's, I think, is his accurate diagnosis, where you know the difference between right and wrong, but you don't care. You're a supreme narcissist. Some of the things that came out in researching his life story for the biography, which, by the way, Johnny Depp and those guys, they dove into that to find some source, so that Whitey's relationship with his son Douglas was not in Black Mass. That's a storyline. That's information that we developed for the biography. But it did reveal, as a journalist, and reporting and interviewing extensively Douglas's mother, that despite the monster that Whitey is, there was this human connection, this love for his son. And the director and Johnny Depp felt that ought to be in the movie Black Mass, to reveal that. And it's also, in some ways, between that, and they do this in the movie, even though, again, they play with the chronology. And it was I worked a lot with a forensic psychiatrist. I would bring her material, learning about Whitey's life story, and she helped brainstorm about the making of Whitey and stuff like that. And she helped me really noted that, after Whitey's son dies, I mean, he's already monstrous and a murderer and stuff, but he goes even darker. It goes, and Whitey's and Douglas's mother said as much. He went ice cold. He was completely unhinged after that. He no longer, if he had any toe in what I will call our world in any way, it was through Douglas, and then that was gone. He no longer had to think about it as his son might grow up, and he comes home, "Hey, Dad, how was work today?" What he might say, that was all gone, besides the loss. So I think there's a little bit of that, just a tease of that in Black Mass that they were taking, but I think we try to get more deeply into that in his biography.
We're going to extend our conversation at the town hall, or the town offices conference room, just up the road from here on the left. Dick will also be signing his books at the Vermont Bookshop at 5:15 or so. Thanks a lot for coming, and thank you, Dick, for being here.
Sure.
All right.